What's up, everybody? This is Dr. Zach Baker. You are listening to the Strength and Knowledge Podcast. And today I have Dr. Asher Roberts, sports resident here at R2P out of our Frederick location. And he has got his October review of our shoulder research articles that we need to go through. With this, we listened to Tyler previously talk about the shoulder instability in NHL players. And I think Asher still sticking along the lines of the shoulder, but a little bit different sport. Asher, what was the article that you found, and why'd you pick it?
Yeah, so the article is called Comparison of Muscle Coordination During Front Crawl and Backstroke with and Without Swimmer's Shoulder Pain. So I picked this article, honestly, because swimmers are honestly a population I haven't seen a lot of. Right now I'm doing some of my sport coverage hours at Hood College, which is a local D3 college, and swimming season is ramping up, and we're getting a good amount of people in the training room with injuries. And I always hear about swimmer's shoulder, and I was like, hey, let me take a deep dive into the literature here and see what I can come up with.
Awesome. Now, before we get too far into the article, do you mind just kind of defining for us what is swimmer's shoulder? And then also, what is a front crawl? Because I was unfamiliar with that term. And then talk a little bit about just how they went about defining muscle coordination in this as well. And I think I love the article, but the title itself, I've got a handful of questions just from the title.
Oh, definitely. I had the same questions. So swimmer's shoulder, it's basically that like catch-all term for chronic, non-specific shoulder pain that happens with swimmers. It's due to repetitive activity, usually involves some kind of impingement of a rotator cuff tendon, biceps tendon, or some kind of bursa. So really just non-specific, just shoulder pain that happens with swimmers, usually pinchy. Front crawl, that was the first thing I looked up, honestly. That's just freestyle.
Okay,
so
perfect.
That's just another way to call it freestyle. And then coordination, they really were looking more at muscle activation patterns measured with EMG data.
Okay, perfect. All right, now, do you mind going through just the kind of the overall setup of the article itself? So in this research design, who was included and how were they capturing this data, or what were they quantifying with their data?
Yeah, so it was a case control study. So they had 20 elite swimmers all competing at the national level, who had previously competed in college, swimming an absurdly high amount of times, 10 times a week in college. For the controls, they were 100% healthy, no history of any kind of muscle injury whatsoever. Your swimmer's shoulder group, or your injured group, as I'll call them, because swimmer's shoulder is a mouthful, they had to be diagnosed by an orthosurgeon with swimmer's shoulder, which in this study they defined as greater than 3 out of 10 pain for greater than 3 months straight. So that more of like chronic, dull shoulder pain. And how they track that muscle coordination is they put EMG on these swimmers. They put them on 11 muscles: biceps, triceps, lat, serratus, pec major, upper trap, lower trap, internal and external obliques, rectus abdominis, and the erector spinae. They had these guys swimming in a 50-meter pool, doing 25 meters of freestyle, 25 meters of backstroke.
Awesome. It's always interesting when you get into EMG studies and just what the relevance of them is. And it looks like in this article, they're trying to look at what is happening within these different muscle groups at different phases of the swim cycle. Is that correct?
Correct.
Perfect. And they define them as early pull-through, late pull-through, and recovery phase.
Yeah.
Awesome. And then what did they actually end up finding with these groups? So when we have our injured group, we have our control group that was uninjured, which is pretty, I feel like, unusual for swimmers at that high of a level at that point of their career.
Oh, definitely.
But what did they end up finding between these two groups with the EMG studies?
Yeah, so this is where the interesting thing is. So with both freestyle and backstroke, there were two main synergies that they saw across both groups. We'll go through freestyle first because the backstroke is pretty similar. Okay. So for the first synergy happened during early pull-through phase. That's when the arm just goes into the water. That synergy across both groups, you were seeing high amounts of arm, pec, and abdominal activation. The interesting thing is the uninjured group had higher activations of pec major, external oblique, and rectus abdominis. Additionally, during the late pull-through synergy, which was more like upper back activation, your upper trap, lower trap, serratus, those muscles, your injured group had less lower trap activation pretty significantly. That was probably the biggest discrepancy that I saw across them. So we're seeing decreased pec and abdominal activation in the injured group, decreased lower trap activation in the injured group, and then oddly enough, the injured group had a third synergy that wasn't present in the uninjured group. That synergy was just really looked more like a bracing strategy. You were seeing this really high activation of internal oblique, external oblique, and rectus abdominis right before the arm hit the water and right after the arm left the water. So the study hypothesized that this might exist because these swimmers are having trouble coordinating trunk and upper extremity as they're moving in and out of that recovery phase.
Yeah, it makes sense. You think about individuals with back pain. One of that they kind of have two strategies. They either just avoid doing anything, or when they do try to attempt some degree of activity, they just tighten everything up. And they try to recruit all parties to this task, and they brace, and they do a little bit more work than what is actually needed. And that's what came to mind when I heard about this third synergy is we have less activation in areas that are commonly involved with the activity, and we're looking for support somewhere else. Unfortunately, that support from other places doesn't play a direct role in the action that is trying to accomplish. So you end up having higher levels of exertion, which could potentially lead to poor performance, increased just overall energy needed to perform the task, and decreased efficiency with it. Now, what did they find with the backstroke? I know you said that there was some carryover where there were similarities between freestyle and backstroke synergies. Was there anything unique to the backstroke?
Honestly, not really. You're seeing the similar muscle activation patterns, in all honesty, a lot higher erector spinae activity. Okay. And that third synergy that was also present in the injured group across backstroke, you were seeing less rectus abdominis activity and more erector spinae. Okay. So they're still doing similar things. They're still having less lower trap activation and then that bracing strategy as the arm exits and enters the water.
Interesting. My guess with that would be just due to positioning and being supine as opposed to prone. And they're going into a higher degree of extension as their compensatory motion. My thought process, I'm not a swimmer by any means on a competitive level, but if you do not go into excessive extension and you try to go into excessive flexion as your compensation pattern on your back, you're either going to sink or you're not going to continue to propel through the water. So that would be my guess as to why we are seeing that difference between the two.
Definitely.
Now, going through this, when you get to the kind of the takeaway messages from the article, what were the conclusions that they drew, or what were some things that popped up in your mind?
So the tricky thing about this is it's a case control study, so not the highest level of evidence, but we're also dealing with a small population, 20 elite swimmers. It's hard to generalize this to your high school or even college swimmers because these guys are best of the best competing at the national level. So you have to have that caveat in mind with these takeaways. The big thing that you can take away from this is that swimmers with injured shoulders swim differently than swimmers with non-injured shoulders. It's kind of a chicken or the egg situation. Like, do these synergies exist because there's pain, or is there pain because they have these synergy patterns? We know what a good swimming pattern should look like. So in rehab, maybe we're trying to work on training that coordination between like legs all the way to arm. But it's kind of tricky with taking stuff away from this.
It reminds me of EMG studies that I've seen in professional pitchers versus youth pitchers. And you look at the EMG activity of the rotator cuff at various phases of the throwing cycle. And in your elite pitchers, the rotator cuff is highly active during very specific phases, essentially acceleration and deceleration of the throwing motion. Whereas with your youth pitchers, they had increased elevated EMG activity throughout the duration of the pitching cycle. And that, to me, and this was with individuals who were healthy. So to me, that is a skill-based deficiency. And those are individuals who either they're just at an age where motor learning has not completely gone through, or maybe they're just still a novice pitcher and they not have developed the skill for it. And like you had mentioned, maybe these are people who are having rotator cuff, shoulder, elbow issues as a result of those faulty mechanics. Whereas if you get to the professional level, you may reverse that and say, hey, these people normally have very efficient, very biomechanically sound mechanics. The only time that they do get disrupted is when they are fatigued or when they are in pain. And you kind of flip the script there. So I think the one nice thing about this article, using the elite level swimmers, is when you look at sports like swimming and track, it's a very structured event. You know where you're starting, you know where you're going, you have a very direct path to get there. You are told you have to get there a certain way: freestyle, breaststroke, backstroke, fly. And there's only so many ways to do that in the most efficient manner possible. So you can start to assume that these elite level swimmers probably have pretty spot on mechanics. So in this population, I would like to believe alterations of these mechanics are probably due to some reason for them to be altered. Fatigue, pain, something providing this compensatory pattern. Keeping in mind, though, this is elite level swimmers. So we may not be able to take the results of this study and generalize it to your 12-year-old who's having shoulder pain that may have nothing to do from a rehab standpoint of what we're focusing on. If I have a 12-year-old swimmer come in, I'm probably not deep diving into muscle activation patterns of early and late pull-through. The first question I'm probably asking them is, how much are you swimming? Just like a youth baseball player. And it's a repetitive stress injury. So let's address the things that we can handle first and foremost, which is volume and intensity of training. Then if we get through that and we're getting adequate rest, we're having adequate recovery, we're doing all of the basics well with regards to sleep, hydration, nutrition, then we can start getting into more of our PT-oriented skill set. Getting to the end of this article, Asher, what are some takeaways that you have as a clinician, or things that'll be in the back of your mind as a clinician moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, my biggest thing that I take away from this is don't just look at the shoulder, which is already what you should be doing with any kind of kinetic chain athlete. Check hips, check core activation, check their coordination between those things. See if there's any low-hanging fruit that you can work on, maybe when they're in that more acute phase of pain in the shoulder, where you can work on some other things to help them return to sport better than they were when they left it.
I love that. And I think when you look at activities that are total body in nature, that's kind of the cheat code in early phase rehab. When you have a really flared up body part, whether it's an ankle, a wrist, an elbow, a shoulder, whatever it is, there are some things that you need to do locally at the site of the injury to make them feel better and should try to restore just baseline function there. There's also a lot of things they just simply can't tolerate, or it's just going to make it worse if you try to overload them. So as you are managing symptoms and doing entry-level early phase rehab there, you also need to preserve the rest of the body, because we need to make sure, if this is a shoulder injury, that the legs, the core, everything else is not getting too deconditioned from an overall just physical conditioning state. We're talking about energy systems and force output and rate of force production, but also from a coordination standpoint. And are there things that we can do to help integrate these total body movement patterns that are not going to flare up the shoulder? I think it's also an opportunity as a clinician where you can do some detective work and see if you can find a reason as to why they may have certain compensation patterns. And if you're investigating their thoracic spine, their lumbar spine, their hips, their lower extremities, and you find gross asymmetries between the two sides, or you see movement abilities that are far below what you would expect the normal population to do, let alone somebody who needs to swim and getting to some more extreme or just unique positions, that may clue you in as to, hey, why are they doing this movement strategy with their shoulder? Well, you know what? What that shoulder is attached to doesn't move very well. So maybe they're asking the shoulder to hide some of these deficits. So I think that's a huge takeaway and consideration as well. Asher, any other kind of big picture things that come to mind, or did we hit it all?
I think we hit it all, Zach.
Awesome. Well, Asher, Appreciate the time and attention. This is a pretty cool article. It's always fun when you get to dive into some of the tech associated with either data analysis or movement analysis. So appreciate the time and efforts and doing all the dirty work. If you enjoyed this episode, please share, like, and subscribe. You are listening to the Strength and Knowledge Podcast.